And then, hi, hello, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. It's been about 2 weeks. Another long break. We've done a lot of introspection. There's been a lot that's been happening. If you've been awake in America for the past couple of weeks, but other than that, we're gonna go back to the podcast. Keep it local. And our podcast guest today is Chris Olson, one of the founding member of um, uh, Alhambra uh, Alhambra Preservation Group, a grant writer, and someone who's running for Alhambra City Council. So, Chris Olson, I want to ask you, why do something very hard running for city council? Um, Introduce yourself. Go ahead.
All right, great. Thank you, Bryan. It's good to see you again. It is indeed hard running for office. It's challenging. It's exciting. It's a grueling schedule for a candidate, and I think I had never fully appreciated just how tough it is to run for office until I engaged in this process myself. But why now? Now is all we have. Really. I've lived in Alhambra for 31 years, but I grew up in the San Gabriel Valley. I've lived in the San Gabriel Valley all my life. I was born and raised in Pasadena. And I moved to Alhambra in 1989 with my wife, and got involved with the group of people that was interested in preserving Alhambra's historic architecture. And that was in 2004. And I began to see in that process how dysfunctional our city government really was, and how it sort of distorts our democracy by discouraging public participation in government, and real, a real robust conversation about what our community needs are. And that frustrated me for a long time, but I didn't really take it personally. I never imagined at any point in my life that I would be running for city council, or for any public office. It was just never, it was never a thing that I imagined for myself or for my life. My wife, Lisa, was diagnosed with cancer in 2011. And we went through together a really tough time, because as small business owners, we were not well enough insured to deal with a major crisis like that. Right. And especially with a family business. So not only did we have, an incredible thing to deal with in our lives, but our business earnings were cut dramatically through that process. And Lisa went through 4 years of treatment. She died in 2015 on New Year's Eve. And it took me a long time to recover from that, from that loss. We'd been together for 31 years, and to kind of gain my footing again. But I went to a very good friend of hers who was a member of her church. Her name is Dr. Shelby Dietrich Rector. She was a community leader in Pasadena, and a pioneer in hematology. And Shelby was 30 years older than I, and she was kind of a mother figure, and she took me under her wing very purposefully and helped me through the worst of my grief. And I remember talking to Shelby about this sort of idea I had about running for city council. Shelby and I shared a lot, the books that we read and things that we were thinking. And I told her about this book that I'd read called, it was a memoir by Grace Lee Boggs, Working for Change, I think was the title of the book. And it was my first introduction to this amazing feminist philosopher who was a Chinese American, born in Rhode Island in 1915. She had died also in 2015. And she was the daughter of a restaurateur in New York. Her family moved to New York because they couldn't own property in Rhode Island. And they started this business, Chinese restaurant. And her father was kind of the king of the restaurant business in Chinese restaurant business in New York, which meant that they lived kind of a lower middle class life. But she was highly educated. She was a brilliant young woman. She went to Barnard at 16 years of age and got her doctorate in philosophy from Bryn Mawr. And then she found that she was not employable as an educator. No university wanted to hire a Chinese ethicist, a woman, in the Depression.
Mhm.
And so she became enraged at the injustices of both women's inability to get work and the Depression and how this was affecting the entire country.
Mhm.
And she worked for change. And she wrote prolifically. But the thing that really got to me that I shared with Shelby, my friend, was what Grace said about changing communities. And it was, in order to change any society, you have to see yourself as belonging to it and responsible for changing it.
Right.
And I realized, and I talked this over with Shelby, that I had seen all these problems in Alhambra, but I hadn't really taken personal responsibility for them. And now, at this point in my life, newly widowed, getting my sea legs again um, after a great loss, I was contemplating doing exactly that, taking responsibility. And Shelby could not have been more encouraging or enthusiastic. And basically, this woman who was at that point, I think about 94 years old, said to me, "What are you waiting for? This could be the greatest gift that you could make to your community is working for change in
Mhm.
Alhambra." And it still kind of gives me goosebumps thinking about that conversation because she died within a year after that conversation. But she really she gave me a huge boost. And and so that's my path to running for office in this amazing set of circumstances in 2020, like no other.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. I think that might be the biggest understatement of like the beginning of this decade almost.
yes,
Yeah,
truly,
running in these circumstances, and I wanted to ask, given that the Chinese American author lived through such hardships as like 1915, that was like right before the influenza pandemic, and into
right.
economic strife of the 1920s and the 30s. So, do you see yourself? It's not one to one, given this situation, but because it had such an impact on you and inspired you to run, do you feel like you identify with her and her message of like, and you probably mentioned it before, but get into that.
Yes, I do in some ways. Of course, I can't. I mean, we're in entirely different leagues. I look back, and
Yeah.
she was friends with Dr. Martin Luther King um, and Malcolm X, and her husband. They lived in Detroit. Her
Hmm.
husband was African American. He was an organizer for the American Auto Workers Union, and she traveled all over the country with him. But her hometown, where she lived, where they lived together, Jimmy Boggs, was in Detroit. And she did a lot of work in helping the hard hit community of Detroit um, after in the last part of her life. And I think originally she saw herself as a revolutionary, and she came to see herself as as an evolutionary,
Hmm.
helping the political process, better serve all of her all of the people of her community.
Yeah. That being said, I would audience members would probably want to hear your campaign platform. So let's have the
Okay.
audience know what are some of the main points that you want to address in Alhambra. I know we've had kind of like a tenuous history. Like I don't think we ever worked together per se, but we run around the same circles. You know, like Ken Tang, that was one of our podcast guests before, has endorsed you, and Eric Sonata, you know Eric Sonata and his campaign, and we're gonna get into that because we during her not her during his podcast we talked about campaign finance reform. So, do you want to spend a little time just explaining your platform right now?
Sure. And in fact, I think I met you originally through Eric Sonata.
Hmm.
You were at that time working for, I think you were working for Asian Americans Advancing Justice and working with Lee Furumoto in a project that was about helping Asian parents, not all of them Chinese, to sort of better speak and practice their English
Hmm.
at the First Baptist Church in Alhambra. And Eric took me along on a couple of the meetings that he attended in speaking, and I think that's where we first met. But so one of the primary issues, the basic issues in my campaign, is about um, um, sort of advancing democracy, I guess, is what I'm saying by campaign finance reform and election reform, bringing more people into the conversation than Alhambra's been able to do before, um, and increasing civic engagement as a result. So that means I was involved from almost the very beginning with Measure V. Um, I walked door to door to get um, signatures on the petition that would put it on the ballot, and I support it and am one of the candidates that has endorsed it. Um, and I also support affordable housing. It's an issue that has been long neglected. Not,
Hmm.
I mean, there's been very little attention paid to the issue of affordable housing, and we have almost no affordable housing stock in our community. Historic preservation is how I got involved in this community in the first place. So that's part of my platform too, saving and developing a process for understanding our architectural and cultural history, and determining what um, what buildings are um, important to save, and developing a process for identifying um, and applying to have them preserved. And also planning for sustainability of our community and dealing with climate change. So those are the top issues, I guess, that I would identify of many.
Yeah, and given that it's 2020 and like there's so much uncertainty, and you bring up a good point about campaign finance reform, and this past 2019 we learned that there was a city hall member, Jose Huizar, in Democrat in like the LA community, taking bribes, and that's an egregiously illegal example of how campaigns can be financed. But there are also legal ends where special business and special interests can come in and fund campaigns. And I think reg- like this is a local measure in Alhambra, but this has wider implications for, I feel like, the greater LA area, not just LA, but also the state, and even the state and even the United States. When you see large companies donate millions of dollars towards a campaign, and you start to wonder as a citizen, it's like, well, do they have the same interest that I do? Like a company that values, say for example, fracking, they would invest in a candidate that would save those jobs or save that that idea of polluting and, like, by any means necessary sort of situation, and in gaining wealth. So I think what I'm trying to get at is, like, I think Measure V is something important, and if you want, you could get into that, kind of like the
Sure,
details of the details of Measure
sure.
V.
Well, I'm proud to have been involved with that. I didn't craft the measure itself, but I was involved with discussions from the very beginning about what it should contain. And it basically covers three things. One of the things that's most needed to address improper influence in decision making by our city council members or by any elected officials is transparency, understanding, and having access to information about where the money comes from that funds a campaign for public office. In Alhambra, we have no campaign finance laws, and the Fair Political Practices Commission requires that the candidates submit reports regularly. I just filed my second one of this year on who the donors are. But it's hard to find that information. So one of the things Measure V would do would be to require that our city publish those reports on the city's website so that any citizen can look up and find out who's funding political campaigns in our city. That's like one of the most important parts of this measure is transparency, understanding where the money comes from, because as you've mentioned, large political donors can influence the vote. And I think we've seen that several times in our own city. So another element of Measure V is a limitation on how much can be contributed to a political campaign, to a candidate-controlled committee by an individual or corporate donor. And that level has been set at $250 to kind of even the playing field. And because I think that's so important to show that that no donor is more important than any other donor, I've purposefully, even though I didn't have to, I've purposefully limited my own campaign contributions that I've accepted to no more than $250 per person or business, because I want it to be clear to everyone that my vote won't be bought. So campaign contribution limits, transparency, and the other element that's critically important is by district elections for a couple of reasons. One is it offers better representation to the citizens of Alhambra to be represented by a city council member that they know who it is and can contact when they have problems. Right now, we have 5 districts in Alhambra, and we have 5 city council members. But what we have is an unusual, in the state of California, situation where we have from district elections. So city council members live in their districts, but they're elected at large by the entire community of Alhambrans. And that dilutes the impact of votes within a district, because in Alhambra we have 2 districts in the community in which there's a larger voter turnout, and they are District 1 and District 5. A higher percentage of the residents, of the citizens, registered voters who live in those districts vote than in any other. So people who live in other districts wind up having the people in District 5 and District 1 essentially elect their candidate or their council member. And the other thing it does is it makes elections very expensive. Mailers are one of the most expensive parts of a political campaign. Sending communication to every voter in the city of Alhambra is incredibly expensive. I could not possibly do that. I sent out a mailer to about 10,500 voters. And despite the fact that I saved every penny I could, it cost almost $6,000 for me to
Hmm.
send that. Actually, it did cost $6,000 for me to send that. And I didn't attempt to send a mailer to everybody. If one were to do that, it would be outrageously expensive, which means that you have to essentially, you're set up, candidates are set up to go to the big donors and ask for large contributions. And
Right.
too often, those donors then have more entree to the city council member that they've helped elect because, it kind of makes sense.
And I'm hoping for your campaign, just in the way of, it's grassroots, just like Eric Sonata's, and I hope that voters do understand that, there are big interests. I granted this is not a national election, but listen, if you are worried about the day to day in your city, and be honest, this is coming from a guy that doesn't live in Alhambra, but be aware that things that happen to you day to day are from your city, and the decisions that affect you in those in that intimate way comes from the city. And if 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 you get a candidate that gets this pay to play, sort of gets bribed by foreign speculators to build these high price apartment areas, and you see people screaming like, why are you building this, we can't afford it,
Right.
that's where you get those situations. And I think this is something that's very important. And with your conversation about different districts, and how votes are weighed, it reminds me of that conversation we had with Eric Sonata, and how, in his campaign, though it was a very close vote, he did understood that one of the reasons why is that you had this system where some people are way more empowered in their voting capacity than, other parts of Alhambra. And so what is, I wouldn't, what's fair in that situation, you know when, if you consider it as a citizen, you know the, the people that get the most attention are the people that put more money into a campaign. So
Of
I
course,
think
those
this is
calls
very important
are
work.
the calls of major donors are always going to be returned first.
Yeah.
And when a council member votes on a project that that benefits a major donor, um, it's really hard to know whether that project is truly in the best interests
Hmm.
of the constituents, of the citizens of the community, or if it was done because, the council member and the donor are close as a result of that large contribution. And and that's why it's important, I
Hmm.
think, for council members, for elected officials to recuse themselves from votes that benefit their major donors. And um, and my opponent has not done that,
Hmm.
despite the fact that he's been asked to multiple times. And I think that ethics rules, related political ethics, demand that.
Hmm.
I mean, it's not illegal for an elected official to vote on a project that benefits a donor or a major donor, but elected officials are also stewards of the public trust,
Hmm.
and it's important that we be able to trust our public officials and believe that the votes benefit us over the political donors. So yeah.
So more on the details, for Measure V. What are the arguments against it, and who's funding those arguments? Is like we often ask, it's like, oh, what are the arguments, but we never really ask, who's funding the no on Measure V sort of situation. Do you know who's either funding it, or what are the arguments against it?
Well, the arguments, I know a little bit of both. The arguments against it are, to my mind, illegitimate. Um, the the primary one is that citizens of Alhambra are giving up 4 of their 5 votes,
Hmm.
and that this decreases their representation. Um, and I think that's the primary um, issue that they've raised in their mailers and their signs,
Hmm.
and that's just not true. Um, and the donors, there is a no on measure. The group that is, they call themselves Friends of Alhambra. They filed their campaign paperwork very late in the process,
Hmm.
and they just this last week they filed a donor report. Former council member Barbara Messina is the largest donor so far, and there are other smaller donors as well, but we only see a few of them in the reports. I'm sure that after the election, more information will be made available. So far, it's been a kind of opaque um, group that's not really identified themselves very clearly.
Yeah. Moving on a little bit, and not to devalue the Measure V importance in campaign reform, but another thing that really affects Alhambra in a very tangible way is affordable housing, and
Mhm.
um, much of the residents see and understand that there's not that much housing in Alhambra, and something that me and Eric Sonata had long conversations about is this idea that. Uh, that just build more houses, build more apartments. If we build it, they will come. But the argument for me is that if you build it, but for whom? That's the question. And if these apartments are going to be pricing out the community that lives and works and in these schools, in these restaurants, in these small businesses, it's like I've seen recently one of the black-owned carts or businesses is now moving into the Inland Empire, and so
No,
that from what I've heard, yeah,
the guy in Alhambra.
yeah, I just saw on their Instagram that they're leaving, and and it's not. It's just a terrible thing. It's like, yeah, Alhambra has this whole foodie culture, all of these things, but it's fragile. It's very fragile. And given that we're in this current situation with COVID-19 and economic strife, there's been basically a standstill on support coming from the national level. It's very fragile. We can be the foodie area of Southern California, but we're one economic, depression away from that not being a thing. And if we just keep building these apartments, these areas, it's like I worry because I've seen what happened in '08 what in Nevada, in Clark County, where they built these large housing sections, and they're still building right now. And you're looking all across the horizon. It's like, well, if we're gonna get to a point where so many people are getting kicked out of homes, moving away from these urban areas, what's going to happen? You know.
Right.
So, how do you feel about the housing situation in Alhambra? And there's this big thing right now with the villages in Alhambra. I know that's a big hot button issue when it comes to Eric Sonata and some folks that I talk personally about in Alhambra. So, what are your views right now?
Well, first of all, our housing crisis in Southern California and in Alhambra in particular is not going to be solved by building more market rate and certainly not by building luxury housing.
Right.
Um, our median home price over the last 20 years has increased 250%. But the income of people in our community has in salaries has only increased by 45%. So there's a major gap between housing costs and income. And in fact, our low and middle income households are severely rent burdened or
Hmm.
cost burdened from housing costs. Right now, more than half of Alhambra residents' households qualify for affordable housing. So for low or moderate income
Hmm.
families. These are our neighbors. These are, the people we know, as you say, the people who work in businesses. And we have almost no affordable housing stock in the community. And that's because we focused heretofore on market rate housing. Um, what we do have is a very small percentage, and it's focused on seniors. And I think that's fabulous. I am a senior myself.
Right.
But I think we have to acknowledge that keeping a thriving school district going requires that we have young families who live here as well.
Hmm.
And um, and this hasn't been a priority. So that's why the state has stepped in to address the crisis in affordable housing, because cities like Alhambra have failed to do so. Um, but I think we need to focus more of our HUD and CDBG funds,
Hmm.
and utilize state tax credits to do things like pass the inclusionary housing ordinance that we did just pass, but that's not the entire solution. We have
Yeah.
to actually um, work to build and um, and create more affordable housing options for people, because not only is it about meeting the needs of our own community, but it's about meeting the needs of the planet. We can't keep pushing people out to farther and farther away from job centers,
Hmm.
and um, and into places that have fewer services, because it increases carbon emissions, um, and a burden on the environment. And we got to figure out how to do it here, and
Yeah.
that's why it's a priority in my campaign. I'd like to see more supportive housing. I'd like to see supportive housing built. I know that we have one project that we're currently looking at right now, but we need more.
Hmm.
Supportive housing is the best way to transition vulnerable people from homelessness or near homelessness to successfully living on their own. And it combines on site services with a community.
Yeah.
Last year, I went on an amazing, I don't know if you participated in any of the tours that were done of affordable housing units that were sponsored by Everyone In campaign of the
Hmm.
United Way, but it was eye opening to me to go to Pasadena and see Marb's Place, which is like a show place for supportive housing programs, and others in Los Angeles as well that are successfully creating community for families who need extra support and helping them um, move on to living on their own.
Yeah.
And that's what's required.
Yeah. It's about being independent,
Mm.
um and how could no conservatives kind of see that, right?
Yeah.
Is that built, pick yourselves up from your bootstraps sort of argument. But um I want to give you my impressions on this idea of poverty and the issues that we are seeing down the line. Coronavirus has been a thing since the beginning of March, but you know, something I was listening to another program is that we're not going to see the effect once we get the vaccine. It's not like it's going to be over. This this thing, this pandemic is gonna be an issue for almost generations. If for
Yes.
folks that, lost everything through this, right? Wanting to build like their own family build a business, want to build their own wealth, that's not gonna happen anymore.
Right.
That's gonna be the reality for many Americans. And do you share those thoughts? Because what I'm feeling is that these people that are newly homeless right now these are folks that they're teachers, there are programmers, there are restaurateurs, they're the people that's working behind the scenes you don't get to see, in the Hollywood faced, LA that most people outside of California think of. These are the people of that service community that will be left onto the margin. So do you think my inclination is correct or wrong? Or what
Um,
what what should I be what should I be
excuse me.
thinking about in terms of the idea of what poverty in the San Gabriel Valley.
Yes, absolutely. I think you're right. This has been the most unequal recession so far that
Hmm.
we've ever experienced in this country. And um, low wage workers are losing their jobs at about 8 times the rate of higher wage workers, and they're not regaining them.
Hmm.
And that is gonna continue for a long time. And folks in the restaurant business, in particular, upon which Alhambra has staked much of its sort of business identity, are among the hardest hit because
Right.
restaurants have a very slim margin,
Hmm.
and um, and especially in I think in a community like Alhambra, which is driven by our restaurant business is largely driven by cuisines of immigrants to this
Hmm.
country, who bring their recipes and their creative ideas and put together whatever money they can to fund their businesses, and they often operate on an even smaller margin than other local restaurants, and certainly than chain restaurants.
Hmm.
Um, and the demographic losses from this pandemic are mothers of school age children who are not getting their jobs back, particularly people of color, young folks from 25 to 34. Um, Many of those jobs are not going to return.
Right.
Um, and so obviously that's going to deepen poverty in our community and in other communities around the United States. Um, I think that in particular in Alhambra, we've failed to build resilience into our economy
Right.
because we don't have a local industry or sort of job base that pays higher salaries.
Hmm.
And um, and that's an issue for young people in particular.
Yeah, that
Um,
was oh, sorry. I was
no,
gonna
it's
say,
okay. Go ahead.
yeah, that was something I was talking with Eric Sonata about. It's like, we live in like this kind of multi-city area, and like the area I live, all we have is a Panda Express and SoCal gas and water.
Yeah,
And like whatever what are the other industries? Like we don't have, for example, a Tesla or a Silicon Valley's type of money going on in this area. It's like,
right.
we're kind of like that service area, tourism based sort of situation, like literally there is a hotel being built in Atlanta, in Monterey Park right now. There is a hotel being built in the San Gabriel area right now. So like I think there's a lot of people making this decision and hedging their bets on this idea that this community is going to stay and stick as the immigrant food community. That can be lucrative, yeah, sure, maybe, but it can be very fragile. We've seen family businesses leave. We've seen closures right now, and if we think that it's hard now, wait another year. You're gonna be inheriting a city that's gonna have a lot of issues. And maybe my question is that because this is something that wasn't necessarily talked about in 2020 during your run, like coronavirus hit right in March, like right at the beginning of summer, like is there any conversations to address issues of poverty in the San Gabriel Valley, inside or outside of Alhambra?
I think we need to be having them, and I don't see them having them. See our community addressing that so far,
Hmm.
and that's a problem.
Yeah. And the only thing that I've seen that's worked so far, and as much as I don't want to give credit towards somebody I don't think represents the United States, but like direct payments for people, and this idea that at the beginning of 2020, like only a certain percentage of United States citizens thought that UBI would be a way to stem the flow of poverty, but now um with Andrew Yang that like dropped out of his campaign, and like now, there are like mayors for a universal income. Like, do you think this could be maybe a solution? May not be long term. I don't know. This has to be a consensus with many citizens, but do you think that would be a way to help? Address the issue of poverty. I'm a big fan. Sorry, it's like. So this is my little 5 minutes of, hey, Andrew Yang, where's our thousand? But but do you agree? We got to consider like solutions. At least bring something to the table.
Absolutely.
Couple years.
I do think we need to talk about this and consider it. And honest to goodness, when I first heard, I had not heard about Andrew Yang until, oh, I don't know, about 18 months ago.
Hmm.
And I was sitting on a friend's front porch talking with some neighbors, and one of the neighbors brought up Andrew Yang and his idea of universal basic income. And I'm like, whoa,
Hmm.
that'll never fly in this country. I
Hmm.
can't even imagine a candidate being out there, talking about universal basic income. And then I heard him speak. I went to the California Democratic Convention and I heard him speak, and he was very compelling.
Hmm.
And I started thinking about it more. And then the pandemic hit, and you know, I, I'm not quite there yet, but I know that there have been examples in California. Most recently, Compton on
Hmm.
Monday announced that they're going to begin a program that are going to give 800 residents some cash every month.
Hmm.
And I'm interested in seeing what the results of that are. But also, I know the community of Stockton in California, part of the sort of Northern California farming area that went bankrupt. And it was incredibly hard hit in the last recession. And just, I think it was in 2019, they began a program to hand out money to a smaller number of residents. That program, I think, began in February of 2019, early in
Hmm.
2019 anyway, and it just recently concluded. Um, I think I haven't followed up on it, but from what I understand, the reports were that it was incredibly successful. That the concerns that people, mostly Republicans, express that it incentivizes people not to work
Hmm.
were not true. It gave folks a cushion, something that they could um, get their feet, under them again, and figure out ways of meeting their family's needs. Most of that money went to food. Something like 40% of the money that Stockton distributed to its, small group of people went to pay for groceries. And I think there was a small percentage that went to retail expenditures, and I can't remember what the rest of it was used for, but it wasn't squandered, which is, I think, what we hear, from folks that
Yeah. So
money is
that's
just
like the that's like the
bypassed.
easy argument, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things when the not the podcast, but when the pandemic started to happen, and like this idea of direct payments and UBI started to become more kind of like in vogue, um, is that what I would tell the friends is that, we built an economy surrounding on this idea that we are consumers and we consume, and when like literally like the job market that like let us get an income is gone, then who is left to give us money to consume, at these restaurants and at these, stores, to buy clothes, and to get groceries. It's like, who's left that still has money to get us out of a situation of like desperation. And one of the arguments that our Andrew Yang says is that if you make it available that people cannot think about where their next meal is coming from, then they can actively critically think about what their next steps are to get them out of that situation. And to hear that 40%, more than 40% of that expenditure is for food, it makes me remember that it's like, in terms of poverty, it's like food insecurity is one of the biggest issues that I think we face too, in terms of how, like, in one of the most wealthiest developed nations, we still have people that are very much hungry and living on the margins.
Yes, absolutely. And I can speak to that from my own experience, having gone through some really tough times when Lisa was sick and in treatment. We were still earning money, but we have a big mortgage on this
Hmm.
house. and um, and it was tough to make the mortgage payment and to pay for gas and keep the lights on and the place heated and thankfully we had dear friends who stepped up and
Hmm.
every month gave us food, grocery store gift cards to
Hmm.
pay for groceries. And that enabled us to get by during really, really, really tough times. And I know what it feels like to take that kind of support from people. And, I think folks who get support in this country under the current sort of political ideology feel one down, feel less than, but it is such a huge measure of respect from people who love you and support you and
Hmm.
say, hey, you would do this for me, and it's, I don't know, I keep saying um, when I do speaking engagements for my campaign that the only way we're going to survive is by taking care of one another.
Hmm.
That relates to the the planet, with global warming. It relates to the pandemic, all the crises that we see before us, the economic crisis, the health crisis, the climate crisis. This relates to all of them. We've got to
Hmm.
take care of each other, and we've got to turn ourselves into a society that sees that back at the core of our humanity and our political culture. And that's where I'm trying to come from too.
Yeah,
So,
I feel like that's one of the big main things is that everything is kind of interconnected,
yeah,
whether we don't acknowledge it or not. It's like if people are being pushed out of this urban areas, they're going to go into like areas that previously people have never really settled, and then you get these situations where wildfires happen, and you can have a case of like what happened in Paradise and in central and northern California, where the population just boomed, and then when one fire happened, like just wiped out a whole community.
right.
And so it's about sustainability. And going back to the topic of businesses, as someone who I can tell probably ran a business before, like given what is going to happen now with restaurants and small businesses across California and even across the nation, I think Business Insider has mentioned that um, in March, more than 60% of California restaurants has closed. So that's about 5,600 restaurants just estimated. And many of those can be permanent.
Yeah,
Restaurants that we know and love, like family owned businesses, leaving the community. We've had an example, once before. This was pre-pandemic. A breakfast and lunch spot on Atlantic and Huntington left the city of Alhambra. So what can you imagine be the next steps in addressing, keeping small businesses whole during not just this year, but in the subsequent years? I don't know if that's a word.
well, for my
Subsequent.
campaign, I don't claim to have all the answers, but inclusivity is a big part of my political ethos.
Hmm.
So, and the centerpiece of my campaign. So, my goal will be to bring together folks who have experience, not not in pandemics, obviously, but in financial crises, in business crises like this, to collaborate with.
Hmm.
We have major local institutions and experts in business and um, um, like JPL and the USC School of Business and others that we can consult with on these things. I think for the restaurant community, it's going to involve a shift, most likely, to things like shared kitchens
Hmm.
and figuring out ways to continue to do the kind of outdoor dining that we've adapted to in the pandemic. That's going to be hard in the winter months, but not impossible.
Yeah.
Um, and food courts where where, as I say, we can do these sort of shared kitchen opportunities using spaces that are not being currently used, retail spaces in our community along Main Street and Valley that are empty,
Hmm.
and not probably not going to bring back tenants very soon.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that idea may also be used for empty office spaces, because I think what businesses have learned through this pandemic is how to successfully pivot to online, um, work from home kind of
Hmm.
situations that don't require massive office spaces anymore.
Right.
So, to the extent that we have empty office spaces in Alhambra, we might want to look at how to adapt those for affordable housing as well. So,
Yeah, here's hoping.
yeah,
Switching gears, I didn't want to talk about just kind of like the culture of Alhambra, and we did talk about food culture, the foodie um, sorry, let me back up, rewind. Like the culture we have here. I think one of the things Andrew Zimmern said once before is like travel on this one block of San Gabriel Valley, and you could travel through all the provinces of China and all of like the subsections of like different places like Ethiopia and like Africa and Southeast Asia, and culture in those terms, but one of the biggest things that happened recently, given literally a month has passed. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, passed away, and now there's a lot of things that are been coming up recently about things like Roe v. Wade and and even something recently, same sex marriage. And so,
yeah.
what I wanted to ask and is that is Alhambra that supportive for communities like LGBTQ and people who identify as that
Well, I've I've been
identify
out
in the
here
community. Yeah.
for 31 years, and I can say that I've met more gay people, LGBTQ people, since I've been running for office than I had in the entire 31 years before that. But that's just because I'm running out. And so folks are finding me
Mm-hmm.
and reaching out to me and thanking me for running, um, and representing all of us. Um, and um, and that was an important decision for me. I know that many people talk to me, mostly older people, um, older than I, who said, "Are you gonna run out? And are you gonna be out as a lesbian?"
Mm-hmm.
And I've been out for all this time, so it would be ridiculous for me to not talk about the fact that I am a lesbian. Um, and part of the LGBTQ community. So not just to let other folks know that um, that's who I am, but to let people in our own community know that
Mm-hmm.
we are finally represented. I know when Alhambra devised its sort of vision statement to be the premier family-oriented community in the San Gabriel Valley, they weren't thinking about my family,
Mm-hmm.
and and when they adopted that vision statement, it stung. Um, and um, so so it's not that we have any particular meeting place to go and connect with other folks in the community, but I have felt the embrace of the LGBTQ folks since I've been running for office. It's not an unfriendly community to live in, but
Yeah.
we are disconnected from one another, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And
And
yes, I'm
oh,
very worried about the Supreme Court, and the decision of Obergefell and Hodges. B. Hodges was, decided in large part because of the presence of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and it's a huge loss to jurisprudence, but to women's rights, to LGBTQ rights, um, and I'm going to keep fighting.
yeah, I know it sounds no, I wouldn't say condescending, but like it sounds weird, like going back and forth between national and local, and like
Yeah.
yeah, the things that are happening in with Amy Comey Barrett and like
Yes.
really not answering the questions. And yeah, you can make an argument that justices should be private in how they vote, how they would vote, but there are very like these big cultural milestones like the voting rights um law that basically got removed once Obama got into office. And we're seeing the effect of that happening in all of these battleground states. And I worry about that. Like, how comfortable are we until it reaches to the shores of California?
That's right.
So things are kind of like put in onto um, a balance, I guess. And I just, I'm just kind of hoping that there's more understanding and um, more individuals such as yourself that um, can live without like you live out without being uh, I wouldn't say persecuted, but like met with hate comments
Right.
and prejudices in
Right.
that way. And moving on to another culture question I wanted to ask is like, sorry, this hurts me a lot too, but I'm gonna try to get through it. Our current commander in chief, always referred to this coronavirus as the China virus, and we're probably gonna hear more of it tonight, given that this is gonna be
Yes.
a presidential debate. But every time those things get said, and I mentioned this with one of our podcast guests before, is that even though you can make the argument and say, oh, he's just playing to his base doesn't know that. Like, as a person that identifies as Southeast Asian, I still get the like the comparisons like, "Oh, you're like your English is great for a Chinese for a Chinaman." I had that happen once. And I'm just like, "Excuse me?"
Yeah.
I was born in this new place called West Hollywood.
Right.
Like, what? and and now I'm seeing this a little bit more, like my family Asian owned business in Nevada. And I worry for them more because they're not in like a predominantly community of color, but they did build respect, but not everybody has that same advantages. And I just worry about that. And getting to my point, I'll get to my point in a bit, but Alhambra and the San Gabriel Valley itself has this large community of Asian Americans. What can you say to, I wouldn't say guarantee, like to address like the fears that the Asian American community is fearing right now, coming from basically the highest office of the land.
I think absolutely Alhambra is an Asian majority community, and um, and our city council missed an important opportunity to make a statement in response to the nonsense that started coming from the president about the China virus. Um, Early on, our city council should have, in one voice, said to all of us, words matter,
Hmm.
people matter. We are all Alhambrans. We are all welcome here. This is not okay to refer to this and, in essence, blame a particular group of people of color. Um, and I think that that issue of words mattering um, and respecting all of us. Another opportunity was lost when our council decided not to declare ourselves a sanctuary city.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think it's the same kind of thing. And I get this. There's a very dear friend of mine who's part of my walking group. I've known her for uh, 4 years now, and we would see each other basically twice a week. We're members of a running club. Used to meet up at the Rose Bowl. During the pandemic. We haven't. And for a long time, we would meet every Wednesday night to put in the mileage. and she's Chinese, and as are a number of the members of this club. And um, so, of course, we stopped when it stopped joining together on Wednesday nights and Saturday mornings when it became obvious that it wasn't a healthy practice to be in close contact like that. And when things began opening up again, I reached out to her and I said, "Hey, let's start up again. We'll wear masks. We'll walk distance, but let's at least get some mileage in because I'm needing to get some exercise." And she put me off and she put me off and she put me off. And it was months before we started walking again. And eventually she told me that she was scared to be out walking. And I felt so ashamed that I didn't understand that at the time because she said she had a friend who was a who worked for a police department in Southern California and who was, I think, a dispatcher, and who told her about instances where folks were being assaulted, when they were out, walking and stuff, and
Hmm.
being yelled at and talked about the Chinese virus and stuff like this. Um, and I felt ashamed that I didn't realize that that's what her motivation was for not wanting to come back sooner, because
Yeah.
I know what that feels like. I know what it feels like not to be Asian, but to be part of a hated minority and to be spit upon and, screamed obscenities at and, messages that feel like hate, that feel like you don't belong here.
Mm.
And, um, and we have to do better.
Yeah.
We have to make it clear that this is on all of us. Survival is on all of us, and we've got to all work together.
Sorry. Thank you. I didn't. I didn't necessarily intend to have this extreme reaction, but this has been really on my mind ever since. He for him, he's not playing it down. He's playing it up for his
Right.
base. And the thing is, when I was in Nevada and when I'm like going down the strip, and the people that be willing to travel and go to Las Vegas right now are not necessarily the same type of people that are taking the virus seriously. And
Yeah.
I understand if I'm gonna go help take photos for my mom and dad at the Bellagio or whatever, having a good time. We don't want to be ensconced by racist people calling us, the China virus and like anything up to the effect of that, and just being very ignorant in that type in those terms. And sorry, it's getting me. Sorry, it's getting to me too, and it's a combination of anger, sadness, and grief for folks like me, and then the next generation, because this is almost like turning the clock back. We had Japanese internment, we had the Chinese exclusion before. I don't think, see, I don't think it's gonna happen again in those terms, but we've have these places on the border where we put children in and separate families. So it's it's I want to hope for the best, and me being the eternal optimist, I'm always like, yeah, like always keep that positive energy, but things are fragile in those terms.
And we
And
can't go back. We have to stand together.
yeah, and keep moving forward.
Yeah.
So I wrapping up, but I want one final question. And
Okay.
it's the same question I asked Ken Tang. Um, and I preference this is with, once people become elected officials, sometimes situations get in the way, and like not all of the campaign promises can be fulfilled. As much as we want to try to project and tell each other that I'm gonna do X, Y, and Z. The question is, you're in office. What is the one thing, at least one platform topic that you have on your website? Something that you really, really want to accomplish in your term as a city council member? Tough
um,
question.
I
Don't
know.
worry about it.
I know. Affordable housing. I want to
Mhm.
make sure that we're on a path to providing housing for everyone in Alhambra. housing access for everyone in Alhambra and making sure that no one gets left out.
Okay. Well, thank you, Chris Olson. You'll find her and her at her election website, uh, chrisolsonforalhambra.com, and check out Measure V, and the people who support it and the other candidates this for the city of Alhambra. I don't necessarily live there, but I do patronize and the stores and grocery outlets, the art studio that's there, Nucleus, and work at the Alhambra Dream Center. And oh, that might have been a secret. But you know, an alumnus of the school, and somebody that wants to give back. So it's important to know who the leaders are in our community. So thank you for taking the time to sit down with me, Chris. And I hope the best, you know, and then
Brian,
maybe podcast in the Alhambra City Hall.
that would be fabulous. I'll look forward to that.
All
Thank you,
right.
Brian, for
Thank
your
you.
time and for inviting me.
Bye bye.